Great. Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the third day of the 2021 UN Virtual Forum on Responsible Business and Human Rights, the new decade of action. This forum has been going on since 2016, and it convenes governments, civil society organizations, human rights defenders, trade unions, academia, national human rights institutions, and of course, business enterprises, with the aim to have a constructive dialogue and peer learning on how to strengthen responsible business and human rights in the region. As you know, this is a joint forum this year, which has been organized by ILO, IOM, UNICEF, UNDP, UNESCAP, UN Women, UNEP, and the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. We have a fantastic panel today, and but before we go to them, just a bit of a quick introduction on the topic for our discussion today. We're looking at the internet and looking at the gender elements of the internet and data governance today. That the internet has transformed the world we live in. It's changed the way we communicate with each other. It's connected people from across the globe and opened us to new ways of thinking. It has made information more freely available, but has changed the way we understood knowledge and information as well. And we are also seeing activists and social justice groups who are using technologies and digital spaces to get informed, to raise awareness about specific issues, advocate, organize protests, and report abuses, especially during COVID 19. We so dependent on the virtual world. We've actually witnessed a proliferation of digital activism as well as a whole new range of digital technologies. But while we're looking at that, we also know that a digital gender gap exists. We also know that meaningful access that could support the actualization of human rights remain conditioned by these digital divides that intersects with gender identities, multiple ones, including the urban-rural divide between the educated and the rich, and the poor, and the developed and developing nation. We know that almost half the world is still offline, and majority of these who are offline are women in developing countries. So today we'll just want to kind of understand how some of this is playing out with women, and what can private sector actually do to actually improve the condition of women and advance a gender equality agenda. We have an absolute powerhouse of a panel today, and I'm going to invite them one by one to do a quick introduction. I'll start with Helene. If you could actually just do a quick introduction, and then we'll go to the next panel. Okay, sure. Can we go to Jack then? Jackie, could you do a quick introduction, Jack, of yourself? Jack, can you hear me? Are they able to hear? Sure. Jack, can I go to you and ask you to do a quick introduction of yourself? I don't know if you're able to hear me. They're not able to hear me. Is anybody able to hear Jug, Purnima, Tenzin? None of them are able to hear. Let's try again. Jack, are you able to hear me this time? Can anybody hear me? Oh, great. Thanks. Helene, can I start with you and ask you for a quick introduction? Just a minute introduction to yourself, please. Can't hear?
I'm Hilani. I run a think tank called Learn Asia. We work on infrastructure policy issues in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Our tagline is that we are pro-poor and pro-market. So we really have an interest in private sector investment in many of the infrastructures to make people's lives better.
Thank you so much, Helene. Can I come to Jack? Jack, could you do a quick introduction?
Oh, hi, my name is Jack
Jackie,
SMT.
yeah.
I'm a feminist tech activist based in Malaysia. I work on an intersection of various issues, including internet governance, sexuality, women's rights, online gender-based violence. I am currently also in the process of founding a feminist technology fund called the Moon Fund.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Jack, for that introduction. Jug, can we request you for a quick introduction?
Of course, yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Jag Gill, and I am the founder of an early stage technology company based in New York, but we work globally. And what we do is we work in supply chains, like in the supply chain of retail and apparel and fashion. And we gather data for transparency and traceability in order to support social compliance and improved purchase practices and improved supply chain practices to essentially improve the lives of workers in the supply chain.
Thanks so much, Jag. Can I come to Purnima next, please?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. And I'm Purnima Dore. I'm an economist, and my areas of interest are around regional development, policy, industrial economics, and what that means from a perspective of growth and equity. I've been a crossover from the corporate to the development space. I've worked with the Tata Group across many of our group companies, particularly in the domains of corporate finance. And on the development side, I'm currently with the Tata Trusts, which is the philanthropic arm of the Tata Group. And within that, I've looked at different portfolios. Currently, what I work on is data-driven governance, within which we look at how data and technology can be used for better development outcomes, working closely with the bureaucracy and with various technology partners. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Purnima. And lastly, Tenzin, if we could come to you. Brief introduction from you.
Afternoon from Singapore. Thank you for having me here. I am the Director for Government Affairs and Public Policy for Google, and I covered Southeast Asia and South Asia frontier countries.
Thank you, Tenzin. And as I said, we have an absolute cracker of a panel today. I hope we'll continue with no further technical hitches. Helene, can I start with you? Given that you've been undertaking research for so long, uh, how do you think men and women and also gender diverse and queer people, how do they experience the internet differentially? And how does that online gender identity help or hinder people's digital participation?
Yeah, so
Go ahead,
Suchitra,
Helene.
I think the first point I think what we need to recognize is that there are far fewer women who are actually enjoying a digital life when compared to men. So before you even get to what it is like to be online for men versus women, right? We really don't have a lot of data about gender diversity or queer people. But even if we look at the simple binary of men and women, a 1-0 kind of dichotomy, we know from our own work, very systematic surveys representative of everyone over the age of 15 in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, in about 23 countries, the gender gap when it comes to ever having used the internet is so vast. We have very rich countries in this survey, like Argentina, which has almost no gender gap. Sometimes it's reversed. There are more women, slightly more women online. But if you look at the poorer countries, the gender gap goes from 10% in Ecuador to 62% in Bangladesh and similarly in Rwanda. So in a really large country like India, we're talking about a 67% gender gap. 67% less women have used the internet when compared to men. The reasons for them being offline is related to the structural and historical disadvantages women have had. They have less education, less income, less decision-making power, and lagging behind in skills when compared to men. So even when women are online, to have a safe and experience on the browsing other than just passive browsing, 50% of the men can change the settings, do a search and so on, but only 25% of women can. So that's just men and women. Now, once for those who are online, we have some data about what that experience is like. We asked about a range of online violence and harassment, 5 different categories, from very violent to sort of repeat, this is all violent, but like being repeatedly confronted with images that they don't want, all the way to threatening and physical and online, harassment and so on. And what this shows is that when we control for factors, because obviously men are online more, so we statistically control for, education, income, intensity of use, and a whole set of other behaviors, women are still 48% more likely to be harassed than men. So even when they get online, it's not a very great experience for, a lot of women. Now, through qualitative methods, not through the surveys, we actually do know something about that diversity of gender, queer people, and also women. So this shows a really mixed picture as well. So at the extreme end, we find really horrible narratives coming out from, let's say, our work in Myanmar, where we studied, straight, gay, cisgender, and so on, like a whole diversity. And we saw both parties face risks when online. But the really interesting thing is men, the most frequently or cited harassment is that their accounts are hacked into and they have to pay the hacker. This is a very low digital literacy environment. They have to pay the hacker to get their passwords back. Women, on the other hand, face a range of highly gendered harassments, like a pediatrician a gynecologist outing a woman's inability to become pregnant, and therefore not fulfill her primary role as a woman, these social constructs that we have, constant requests from men for pictures of their genitalia, and so on, highly gendered stuff. So the objective of harassing a man was financial, quite systematically, while the objective of harassing a woman was shame, right? And if we should not think this is just about illiterate or digitally less literate or poor people. These are all from the same socioeconomic category. We know people with actual power also face this, right? So we know, for example, from systematic surveys that women who are running small businesses, who are more educated and active online and using online platforms, face way more harassment. We know from other people's work that politicians face systematic harassment that is gendered, female politicians. So in surveys in over 100 countries, 80% of parliamentarians say that they have been subject to psychological violence. 40% say they have sexually charged images of them spreading across social media, right? The aim of often coordinated campaigns is to take away the focus on the women's political achievement, the campaign, the messaging, discourage them from politics, and ultimately sort of change the democratic process. We also know that AI-based robots who transmit information, particularly gendered disinformation, systematically transmit more information, gendered misinformation about women than men. This is because the learning algorithms have taken into account the biases that are reflected in the data and the language and the images that we have in real life. And yet, and I will end with this, we also know that the digital space is essential. It empowers women socially, emotionally, and economically, right? The internet that enables like hate and violence to spread so fast and anonymously. Also, that anonymity allows people, particularly women, gender diverse women, queer persons, to actually get online and have conversations that are about politics. So we repeatedly talk to people in Myanmar, and in systematic surveys, we see 40% of people report they have more than one Facebook account. Why? They want to have speech that is not about how they look, not about being a woman. They want to have political speech. So they all have a cisgendered male Burma Buddhist picture and identity in one of these accounts. That is the one that they use to engage about politics, right? So that anonymity is important. We know people make money online. In Sri Lanka, sex workers who are selling and doing transactions on their sex trade online are also making a living because of it. They're also being harassed, right? Female politicians, particularly younger ones, the internet is essential because they can't break into traditional media. They don't have the kind of money. So it's a plus and minus. That's what we know from the research.
Thanks, Helene. And it's fascinating to see how even controlling for uh, your demographics, women are still kind of less online, and there is a particular way that women kind of engage with the internet compared to, and as well as what they face in terms of harassment is so different. When we're looking at it, and Helen, you ended by saying there's still so much potential for actually looking at and how women are able to actually come to the internet and use it for economic opportunities. And I'd like to ask Purnima, because you've been working on social development projects, large scale social projects. What are some of the new technologies that you're seeing, and especially in terms of how are they kind of actually empowering women in the social sector in particular, or on delivering services, or in improving governance?
Sure, Sudakshana. I was thinking about the topic, which is the invisibility cloak and its linkage with data, internet, and gender. And I'll go in that order. If you're looking at, what kind of data is really there to be able to look at outcomes right on the field, there is an invisibility angle there also, right? For all those of you working on research or who are trying to develop products, services, the access to, very granular information, which helps to design, particularly which can target marginalized groups or which can, help reach out to those who have limited access. There is an invisibility around some of the data there. Right. There is also an angle where, while the internet, of course, is connecting a lot of people to goods and services, how many people have that kind of a digital, I would say, what kind of geographies have that kind of a, digital network, fiber, and other such access points, which help everybody get onto it. The third angle is this, that increasingly, I see this having happened over the last 10 years, particularly with the kind of technological tools which can help governance getting evolved. For example, now if you do a survey, you can ensure that actually the respondent was interviewed and that information was collected at a particular point in time. It's not fudged data. It's, there are ways to trace back to be sure that you have authentic information about the community you're talking about. We worked at a fairly large scale across, most districts in India and also within the cities. And what I find is that even decision makers, so some of the member of parliament that I've been speaking to, if they have a fund available to, design programs, they want to understand the regional profile much better. To say that if there are 3 things I needed to do for this community, what would they be? Similarly, if a municipal commissioner or any leader in the local government space wants to deliver something meaningful in a 2, 3-year, 4-year period that they are holding that office, they do. The more evolved ones definitely want to understand what are those 3, 4 pointers that they can hit at to make a serious impact. Do we have meaningful information at that granular localized level? I think the answer in many developing countries is no. And so there, I believe that some of these newer tools, so we do a lot of work on collecting information at the grassroots, building in participatory rural appraisals and processes like these with the digital footprint, which, a lot of organizations have used in the past, but without the benefit of the tools that are there today. And that then gives a much more holistic picture right up to a village level or up to a city ward level to tell you that this is the hierarchy of needs that is, coming up in these conversations. So the ability of these tools to pull out data at a grassroots level, the ability of the internet to make this kind of information more readily available for processing, I think that's a definite plus. Where gender plays a role here, and I will take India's example in this case, what are the big problems we are trying to, hit? Nutrition is definitely one. Maternal health and mortality is another. Water access is a third. Livelihoods and women related livelihoods as we are trying to bridge our demographic dividend. And I see these as similar issues across many countries in the APAC. And now many European countries are also facing, going back to facing some of those issues. I find that the front line that is delivering these services through the government channels or through private channels. If you look at water, women have the best kind of data about access to water because they are the ones doing the work of getting the water home. Healthcare, the last line front mile is in India, it is the ASHA or the A&M worker. Similarly, I have seen in Malaysia, Vietnam, you have women who are taking care of that final last mile. They are the best sources of granular information and best placed to act if they have the right kind of information. The third, education. Most school teachers or people on the front line, they're also in charge of service delivery, happen to be women. If we look at financing, the SHG movement across, so many of these countries has largely been looking at women as the center point of saving, finance, managing household, accounts and information. So I see a tremendous potential of empowering this kind of a target group with data, with the tools that can help, improve access. And I see a huge capacity building story there actually, which I think both the government and the private sector need to work on very systematically so that they are not just receivers of tools and technology and information and, do it like this. This is how you can access the internet. No, to look at them as very clear champions on the ground who can play that kind of a role. I don't think we are there yet, but I definitely see that potential of this huge, vast segment that can, come into making the data and the internet story more meaningful.
Thanks, Purnima.
I'll stop
Thanks, Purnima. And what you point out is kind of recognizing the sort of insights and knowledge that women on the ground bring to service delivery and governance is so crucial. Uh, we've been talking of, Helene talked of sort of the differential experience online, and you're talking of, social outcomes. Uh, I, Jag, I'll come to you as a technopreneur. When you hear some of this, and when you've been working on and delivering services and through your platform, what are some of what are you seeing as some of the challenges and opportunities, especially when it comes to women's economic opportunities, from your own experience of managing the platform and your company?
Yeah, thank you so much. So interested in the different perspectives around this table today and grateful to be here. I'm interested in when I think about this session and the objective around understanding the opportunities for advancing gender equality through effective use of the internet, especially platform and technologies. I would add on the word data, and I think we've heard this from the last speaker too. My lens is within the supply chain of retail and apparel and providing technology solutions for transparency and traceability. And I think it's really fascinating. I mean, we don't run a social media platform, for example. We're very much an enterprise platform serving brands, retailers, multi-stakeholder initiatives, suppliers. But I do think, as we look at the range of technologies and platforms out there, for example, take social media. It's really been the social media movement driven by consumers, which is creating change within our sector, in the fashion and apparel sector, putting pressure on brands and retailers to interrogate their practices, viral campaigns from consumers, hashtag who made my clothes, and exposing the situation of predominantly women in the supply chain of fashion, given that women workers make up about 80% of the garment workforce. So that's on the one hand in terms of kind of social media messaging. On the other hand, the domain in which we operate, which is more B2B solutions, harnessing data, to address systemic issues that are happening in our supply chain around workers, worker rights, wages, living wage, forced overtime, unauthorized subcontracting. And even the prior speaker mentioned it, taking a top-down approach, as opposed to the bottom-up approach that social media can take. A top-down approach looks like, for example, influence investors, look at kind of ESG investors and driving change on from the top and putting pressure on corporates and companies from the top, especially public companies that increasingly need to show kind of in better social, environmental, and labor practices as investors, massive investors, pension funds, etc., take a greater interest. So I think that I agree with the last speaker. There's a lot of capacity building, going on in the industry, and increasingly, the idea that brands and retailers in our space must take responsibility, to protect vulnerable workers in the supply chain. Again, predominantly women, migrant workers, for example, and that we need technology and data to do this effectively. And accountability, is key. We must expect companies then to use data and to use findings to make good on these policy pledges that they're putting out there. Adopting better purchase practices that ensures decent work and living wages, and investing in bottom-up approaches that support workers. I will say on the question of technology, technology is there's kind of who builds the tech and then who does it serve, right? So predominantly, men still dominate the industry of technology at all major tech companies. But however, I do feel that there is technology can serve and add value disproportionately to women. And so in our space, using data, using technology, we can integrate a gender lens in what we do, that can support kind of brand and retailer and supplier responses to bring in interventions to support women. And we see opportunities within, of course, new technologies like blockchain, financial inclusion, entrepreneurship for women, social mobility, and of course, the ongoing challenges around adoption by women. Women, kind of adopt technology at a much lower rate, and obviously the inherent challenges around that. I would like to add, a few more points if I do have time. I mean, let's look at the fact that, recent news that women that make up 85% of the workforce are at a greater risk of violence and sexual harassment. And during the pandemic, for example, it was reported that a 20-year-old garment worker in India was raped and killed by her supervisor at one of the major fashion brands, supplier factories. Now, that sort of news is data and news that we in our organization want to integrate into the information that we provide to suppliers and brands and corporates and investors in real time so that it can be acted upon. And I think, this idea that, something that is happening, a factory fire that is happening in India, COVID relief that is not getting to workers in Bangladesh, et cetera, needs to be integrated into real time through technology, through data solutions, and then provided to brands and retailers for immediate action, and then on to other stakeholders in the industry. I've got a huge ton of data points that I can share around, the pandemic. And I think, the pandemic is a great opportunity, for us in the industry, in retail, and apparel and technology, to really address some of these systemic issues, that disproportionately impact women.
Thanks, Jag. And you kind of talk about sort of this, the fact that women are in particular industries and they've been therefore disproportionately affected by COVID, and you're trying to kind of integrate some of these data information, make sure that private sector is held accountable to this, and the accountability issue is really very key. And I'd like to come to Jack, because you've been talking about private sector accountability and sort of the internet governance for a long time. Could you talk a little bit about the existing internet governance, and especially how you feel that there are, if you do, in terms of existing gender biases that might exist within this current internet architecture and data governance that exists?
Thanks a lot. It's been really interesting to hear all of these different perspectives around some of the key issues that have been raised. I am having a slight issue with my technology today, so things are slightly a bit choppy. Okay, so the question around sort of some of the gaps or some of the issues around thinking about gender and internet governance. And as I was reflecting on this, I'm thinking there's probably 3 points that could be raised in relation to this. The first has already been very well covered, which is about the lack of gender disaggregated data. Like, we really, really need a lot more data and research that specifically explores the gendered impact of technology at minimum on the basis of gender. So we've seen this from all the way from access to use to control over tech and resources and so forth. So the lack of this data means that sort of policy making or technology development is really missing this critical lens. And it's actually really hard to find this data. So whilst I was at the Internet Governance Forum, when I was leading the best practice forum around gender and access, we were trying to look for best policy measures that really tries to advance access issues from a diversity lens. So not only just women, but also looking at queer people, migrant women who are refugees, who are indigenous people. And it's actually incredibly difficult to find this data. So what Helani was talking about, and also what Narmar was talking about earlier, is quite critical. And it's really having that diversity and intersectional lens to the understanding of social identity. So really having that kind of power analysis. And then because of this, then we end up having sort of like a compromise and advocacy on specific issues. And I'm glad that Jack Gill was also talking about COVID. And I think COVID has also really made us realize, and I guess we start to witness this expansive laying down of technology infrastructure, technology as a solution and as a response to a lot of our issues. And so, for example, we talk about privacy and surveillance. and the sort of laying down of health surveillance infrastructure as kind of a response and a solution to responding to this particular crisis that we all face. And it affects everybody, no? And everyday surveillance technology is sort of marketed as this really great thing. It helps to keep track of your devices, of your family, of your mobility. It keeps you safe, but it sort of ignores the fact that some people are already facing some people are already extra surveilled. Some people are already hyper visible in data sets because they face surveillance for being particular identities. So whether these are and hyper surveilled in a way that sort of turns you into a data set that is a problem, as opposed to a meaningful, as a stakeholder in the issue, as a participant who is supposed to kind of participate in this development of a policy response that benefits them as equal standing. So you are hyper visible in the data set as a problem. For example, migrant people, for example, queer people, for example. So all of the data for best practices that we can't find show up as hyper visible identities in particular kind of matrices. And I think that it's actually, and we've seen in recent years, and thankfully because of researchers and activists in the field of academia, but also in the field of civil society and think tanks, that really try to highlight the kind of biases that becomes coded into data sets, no? And we've seen this, for example, in terms of Safiya Noble's book on algorithms of oppression. We've seen this in, I think, Cathy O'Neill's research as well, in terms of looking at how algorithms and data sets, when inputted, data sets in and of itself is not neutral. It also carries with it values and assumptions and norms and what we understand to be important questions, important people, and important solutions. And that in itself creates a kind of feedback loop that reaffirms our own biases and prejudices. And that's really important to address and really important to kind of like pay attention to. But as we know, I mean, I can speak about the situation in Malaysia, for example. We are quick to put down technology responses. We are quick to say we need the data to address certain things, but we are so slow in saying we have to also develop in tandem safeguards, in tandem kind of like, you know, also policy and legal safeguards that prioritizes and that sort of puts some check and balances and limits to the extractive tendency of data collection as well when it's done without this, when it's done without a sense of human rights, when it's done without a sense of understanding sort of gender justice objectives and so forth. So that is, yeah, that's really something that I would say is, especially I think in particular contexts, like we are not like the European Union has GDPR and they've worked together to kind of say, okay, we're going to push for privacy as a really critical foundational key point before we deploy, you know, before in the deployment of all forms of technology that will be collecting data. But in Asia, really no such thing. And in fact, the sort of discourse of development, and because there is a real need for data collection, we end up kind of being in this interesting bind, right? Like we need more data, but at the same time, we sort of like in the process of trying to gather more data, I don't know to what end, but we sort of start to lay down data policies, technology, and practices that is missing that critical safeguard and missing that critical engagement. And the third point, and the most critical point in sort of gaps in internet governance, is the participation by broader women's movement. And I think feminist and women's movement already have to take on the universe of issues, like Purnima was talking about, the last mile, first level of a person who's actually resolving a lot of community problems, no, like access to water and access to education and so forth. So the universe of issues, and then we are now confronted with this like increasing ubiquity of technology as an interface in all aspects of social, economic, and political life. And then it's also obfuscated by the neutrality of technology framework. Science and technology presents itself as progress, a solution in the realm of experts. So it makes it very far, really difficult to engage with. And then there is, of course, the problem of insufficient resources in advancing women's rights work. And that is the perennial landscape in which we are facing. But in fact, it sort of really affects us the most. So, for example, in the production of technology, in the mining of rare materials, and the location of server farms, these are often in places where indigenous populations and women indigenous leaders care for and defend for the place. And they are the ones who face attack, they are the ones who get the most impact, but then are the most distant from policy and governance spaces. So I think we just need engagement to thread through how technology and all of these factors is a big part of gender justice work, that it's becoming a key infrastructure that impacts all of our legal policy frameworks, our culture and framework of engagement with each other and with the environment, and it's at the cornerstone of economy and engagement. And an advocacy that requires at minimum women's participation in all stakeholder levels and feminist movement organizing. So this panel, for example, really great to see all of the different kind of like perspectives by women leaders in different fields. Yeah.
Thanks, Jack. And I mean, I love the conversation around algorithm of oppression. We've been talking about data, and how artificial intelligence and data governance these days is exacerbating maybe gender biases. And without having an eye on gender justice, and that's integrated across the entire technology infrastructure, we may not be able to counter some of these existing biases and discrimination that already is there. And so I'll come to Tenzin, and Tenzin, maybe go to you with two questions. One, you've heard from so many of the panelists in terms of data, information, infrastructure. If you could talk a little bit about how, from your vantage point, because you have such a you're working across Southeast Asia. From your vantage point, what are you seeing in terms of the role of private sector, and what are they doing in terms of advancing or even looking at some of these gender justice issues? And maybe to kind of add to that, as a second question, in terms of you've heard from the panelists about the existing discrimination. You've heard from the panelists about the data governance challenges, lack of actually engagement with women's rights groups. What do you think can be sort of the private sector response for that?
Thank you, Sudarshana. A gender equitable internet is good for everyone. And, we really believe that when a diverse group of users, a diverse group really uses the internet, the online world actually becomes more relevant and more useful to people. So that's really, I'd like to share a few things that we're doing in three areas as a private sector company: policies, products, and programs, right? So just taking a step back and looking at Google itself, I think we definitely do have a very big responsibility in deciding, what type of content is actually available on platforms, while ensuring that people's rights to express themselves is maintained. So in terms of policies, we've really created community guidelines, content policies across all of the various products that help to set rules of the road for what is and is not allowed. So on YouTube, for example, many people would be aware of the community guidelines that are in place to help ensure that diverse groups of people are not harassed or bullied online. And we do provide quite a bit of transparency into our policies, refining them, taking feedback, making them clear, listing out new harmful and dangerous challenges and behaviors as as we see this playing out online. So we invite feedback through collaboration from policymakers, civil society, academia, and users as we look through these policies. On products, when we think about creating a space for increased participation around different groups, whether it's women, the LGBTQ plus community, or children, we really think about how our products and tools can evolve to better meet the needs of new internet users globally. We had done some research, Google has something called the next billion users, and we've done a piece of research on looking at gender equity online. And we really found that women's online actions have huge offline consequences. And I think the previous speakers all spoke to this. So the abuse they experience in the online world has really severe impact, and it causes significant harm to women in the offline world, leading to reduced internet participation overall as well, particularly in some of the emerging markets in the region. On privacy, we've also found through this piece of research that women's devices are often shared or monitored. And I think this speaks to the work that Learn Asia, Helani has been leading in the region. 32% of women share their phones at least once weekly. So they tend to immediately delete searches after browsing, and they tend to use private mode or special apps designed to hide apps or files. I think this was really interesting, findings from the research. And because of this research, it helped us to develop a product called Google Go, which really enables a safe browsing experience and access to information without a history mode to really look at online privacy, particularly for vulnerable groups, right? And lastly, on programs, Google has been running various initiatives and programs across the region to help ensure that everyone can participate in the digital economy. And we do this, by ensuring that individuals from underserved and rural communities continue to find ways to learn from the internet and to also upskill. For instance, in India, we launched a program together with Tata Trust, and therefore I'm happy to be on the same panel with Purnima here today. The program is called Internet Sathi, and it was launched in 2015, really with the goal to help narrow the digital gender divide. At that time, India had one of the largest digital gender divides in the world, especially in rural India. Only about 1 in 10 users of the internet was a woman. Earlier this year, we successfully reached the milestone of taking digital literacy to women in about 300,000 villages across India. The success of this Internet Sathi program has proved that digital access and literacy can really open new opportunities for women to gain from this really fast-growing, digital economy, particularly in these COVID times. So with these results thus far, we are committing to support 1 million women entrepreneurs in India. Similarly, I think it's really important to think of new users coming online, like kids and the youth, and even in this last COVID year, or the older generation, right, that's tended to stay offline. The internet really helps young people explore their interests, learn, and create. However, it's, as we know, it can also leave them very vulnerable to various online risks, cyberbullying, misinformation, privacy breaches, and even online sexual exploitation, to name a few. So in ASEAN, to help make sure that young people have the knowledge and tools that they need to make them smart, for them to make smart and responsible choices online, we launched the ASEAN Online Safety Academy together with the ASEAN Foundation. And we ran monthly training and talk series on online safety from November of last year to February this year. This initiative was really designed to help ensure that youth online experiences are safe and positive during this COVID-19 period. So there's really a lot more that can be done in this space. And Google, as just one among many, many different tech companies, I think we remain committed to investing in improving our products, our services, as well as our policies, while continuing to scale what we do. I think that's really important for us.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm looking at some interesting questions which are coming up, and maybe we'll take some of that as well. But you talked of the internet Sathi, and Purnima, you've talked of the issue about not having enough capacity, or one having needing to focus on capacity building for a whole set of people. What are some of the other things that you feel needs to be undertaken to make sure uh, the sort of the gender divide is kind of overcome when we're talking about data governance, and looking using that data for actually taking policy decisions or service delivery? Purnima, can you hear me? Can anybody else hear me? Can I see a show of hands? Everybody else except for Purnima, possibly. Purnima, can you see chat? Sorry, this the data.
I think that, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah, your net is
Am I
kind of
audible?
internet connection. Yes, you're audible.
Can't you? Can see everything. Able to, I think a lot have been a fan, been up. But over the years, what I have definitely resonated with is that there is a lot in terms of leadership structures that need to fall in place to make these stories really happen, or to make some of these changes come alive. Without that, we can have very interesting policies and great, on paper things that sound very nice, but for it to actually see the light of day, a lot of leadership backing and investment is required. um, I've been fortunate, I think, in my roles to engage a lot with these stakeholders at the leadership level. So, businesses on one side, the philanthropic community, government mission directors, senior IAS officers, academia, deans of research institutions, civil society leaders, and community. So, people like the head of the local, the local representatives. Now, what I see across this mix is that the leadership structures need to really sit up and find ways for this integration to really happen. And I think Jack touched upon that too, that in terms of how decisions get made, the data, internet, all of that will play a role if the format in which decision making happens is involving some of these groups as well. And I definitely see that things like privacy by design. So let me give you an example. If a new technology is getting rolled out and it has huge scale implications, who are the people on that seat who are finalizing that, yes, this is the best technology for the target group? I think, Jag also spoke about who's designing the technology and who's receiving it. And that, I think, is key to, framing our leadership structures in a way that are able to have this, cross pollination. So I definitely try that on boards where I am there. We are making sure that privacy by design is being spoken about when the approval process is on for a new technology. Or if everybody is very quick and ready to sign off that, yes, this is the framework or this is the policy, we need to go ahead. Who is asking those tough questions that, have you checked for this, that, and the other? Have you ensured that is the privacy piece also, at that same level as the go to market story? And is it going to follow? Are you telling me in the board meeting that it's going to follow, but really it does not follow later? And somebody has to then do a follow on to make sure that it actually happens. So I think that these are things that structurally, if all leaders, not just women leaders, all leaders are seriously thinking about how do we make sure that in our review conversations, we are bringing in some of these tough questions. It may make us a little unpopular in the room for a while, but I think the organization will be, will thank us later for having, at least made everybody sit together and think in a constructive way without necessarily being combative about what this means, but to think about how do you integrate privacy by design right at the word go. How is the design of this? So let's look at what do we mean by data design. A lot of times I see people talking about information collection being hard-coded numbers and figures. Whereas today technology does allow pictures to tell the same story. And that is so much easier for people on the front line to actually deliver on. Similarly, maps can play such a meaningful role. Can we use those instead of other things where people have to feed in the data? What is the algorithm defining as this is what the profile is? I think those are the points where some of the issues which our co-panelists raised. So a lot is on the definitions, and the groups that are defining the decisions are people who are sitting in positions of leadership. I think the UN system has a great role to play because SDGs, by definition, are giving a framework to the whole world about how do you think about issues of access, issues of scale, and most companies want to align with these frameworks. It's great. Like I do see how some of the governments are partnering with the UN to make the story about localization of SDGs, right? And I'm sure all of us have touched it in some way or the other. Now, those are conversations where the kind of tools that get used can be tools which create better access. So I think it is for all of us who are part of these conversations, and those who are even designing and developing the solutions, the technology players, to we need to find ways to incentivize this being up on the table at the point of design rather than it being an afterthought. The second thought that I had was also this, that how capacities can work across the board. I see a great scope for partnership between academia, between multilateral agencies, private players, early stage technology entrepreneurs, because some of the best ideas I see are at this point of culmination of these diverse strands of thought. So people who are able to understand these different languages and synthesizes it together, I think are going to be very valuable in the time to come to, kind of make this move from an idealistic situation to a reality that, can we can all see work out. Thanks.
Thanks, Purnima. One of the things that you kind of raise is about who's at the table for the design, right? And I know that Jack, you've been kind of working quite a lot in terms of making sure that women's rights group and feminist activists are part of these conversations, especially with the Tech Back the Tech campaign. Can you talk a little bit about how can that engagement be strengthened, and how do you kind of actually work with private sector players to strengthen that kind of engagement?
Oh, let's see. There's definitely several really interesting initiatives by different feminist groups that's really also trying to address this question about so just focusing primarily on looking at kind of like data in this conversation, right? So there's several different really interesting kind of initiatives that is being led and designed and developed by civil society and feminist groups to participate in this conversation and figuring out what some of the issues are. I'll share with you three for now. So the first one is one that is based in Sri Lanka, and it's called Delete Nothing. And what they are trying to do is to document experiences of online gender-based violence for women and also queer people and people of sort of different diversity to really get to the lived experience, because there is no data collection that's being done by the state. So then, okay, this is the intermediary role that a civil society initiative can do. They make sure that it's in all of the different languages spoken in Sri Lanka. They try to make sure that it is really easy and accessible to use. And they also provide information on what you can do if you do experience gender-based violence online. So it sort of tries to act as this really critical conduit to understand the scale and the impact of this issue in order to then translate this into engagement with either private sector or with the government to develop policies. The second one is this initiative called Afro-Feminist Data Futures, and this is being developed by a few researchers in the African region, and they're really doing a map of how feminist organizations and feminist movements in the region is really engaging with data and trying to see what to you is a feminist praxis and practice of data collection. Because we did talk about all of the different ways in which you can collect data that is very different. No? You can have a very extractive approach to data collection where you see people as basically data points that don't really participate in how you design priorities or how you think about what this data is for and to what extent, and all of these different ways in which you can approach data. To the sort of specific needs and gaps that we are really seeing right now. So this project is really interesting because it is actually funded by Facebook. And I think that this kind of like private sector funded projects to respond to a very specific gap and need, whether in terms of practice, whether in terms of understanding, or whether in terms of like participation, with an extremely hands-off approach. I personally have my own skepticism, but I'm also willing to really explore and see, okay, so how can private sector invest in their own accountability, right? So what does this look like? How does investment in their own accountability look like in a way that doesn't mean, okay, I will now fund civil society to be another data point for my I guess my ends, because private sector has very different objective to civil society. You know, like we are like there is a profit-driven thing, even though private sector understand that the impact is much bigger than only the bottom line, and really trying to also push for certain things. But the call to accountability is slightly different, and I think it's also a question of how do we all participate in this ecosystem as different stakeholders to be able to contribute to a much more robust and resilient, accountable environment moving forward. And that is, I guess, an interesting approach to look towards it. And the third one that I wanted to share is in Latin America, and it's not yet launched, but I think it's a fantastic project. It's basically a trans-feminist AI observatory. So they are really trying to get a few countries, feminist groups and researchers in a few countries in Latin America to understand and research and use sort of like right to information and access to information laws to get more information about how particular projects, government projects in collaboration with either academia or private sector that aims to deploy AI systems into sort of public welfare projects. So for example, one of the things are like, okay, so how do we improve delivery of services to younger people who are at risk because they are because they are economically disadvantaged and they're dropping out of school. So how can we use AI systems to better respond to this particular situation? On the surface of it, looks great. But then once you unpack it a little bit more, you realize that, oh, the only data that this particular system is receiving is data that it's basically only collecting data about people who are under a certain economic strata, which means you're actually, again, just creating a picture and over surveilling poor people and poor people of specific demographics and so forth, and then you're exacerbating the situation. So that sort of research from a feminist perspective that really tries to also understand what they call what the framework that they're using is a framework called the matrix of domination that really tries to understand all these different structures of discrimination and disparity to unpack what is this proposal? How is the technology being used? Can we get access or not? And what are some of the key issues that we are facing? So for example, about transparency, about the black boxing of data set, about the black boxing of the role of what is the algorithm even asking? What is the priority? What are we asking them to learn in order to respond to what kinds of solution? This black boxing needs to be unblack boxed. And I think a lot of the black boxing happens also because of how we are currently seeing this, right? Like algorithms is a sort of like a proprietary profit, it's a big part of like sort of the economic model. So I think we need to maybe start to unravel and unfold this a little bit more to really see that we're no longer in this situation where we can talk to each other from our corner and not shift how we see it intervenes with each other, but understanding that we don't come to this conversation at equal footing. I don't have the same equal footing as Tenzin, for example, to participate in a policy conversation, because very different sort of power. So I think one of the questions that I also have, or one of the things that I'm also sort of asking private sector to do, is to really be a much better ally to women's rights and feminist movements and activists, sort of really engaging them as thought leaders. So what Purnima was talking about from the design stage, but not even that, right? Like sort of from the analysis stage, like what is it that we're trying to do here at all levels of this particular trajectory in thinking through development and policy impact. And not only after problems happen and then like come in and help us solve this problem because it's affecting you, because that's the model right now. Like, oh, online gender-based violence is really come in and help us solve this problem after, but we're not willing to change our practices, we're not willing to change our profit model, we're not willing to change the technology, but come in here towards the end and help us, like, deal with this mess. So I think that's not tenable. And how do we really try to like shift this? And I think what is it? That was the last thing that I wanted to say, but I suppose I suppose if I've forgotten it, maybe that's where it's at. But yeah, I guess it's
Maybe
really
can
just
come
trying
back
to
to
advance
it. Yeah.
things.
Yeah, I'd like to, because you talked of this in terms of surveillance, and talked of AI, and talked of how a private sector can be better feminist allies. I'd like to ask Tenzin the same question, in fact. And how do you think that private sector can actually be better allies, feminist allies? Especially, given that there is so much conversation around state surveillance, private surveillance, and as Jack was talking about, there is a particular category of people who are over surveilled, right? Who tend to be vulnerable, who tend to be, especially because of the gender identities, right? So, what would you say? And if you could be brief, we would love to have a few audience questions in terms of just looking at how could private sector be better feminist allies.
Yeah, I think, on that specific thing, right, like making technology for everyone really means protecting everyone who uses it. And I think, that needs to be, I think, the compass. For example, Google was founded on the belief that everything Google does should always respect the user. So as the internet evolves and you get a more diverse set of users using the internet, it also means that we need to continuously advance, whether it's our security technologies, privacy tools, whatever else we can do on the platform, and product design, on UX design, etc., to help keep users safe online. And I think for a company like Google, privacy is the focus of a really massive and permanent effort. And we have, hundreds of employees spending most or all of their time working on privacy-related work across policies, products, and programs. In terms of the algorithms itself, right? We're also very sensitive to the effect of algorithms, and over many years have really rigorously tested products using user feedback. And we've really looked at researching new and better ways to interpret machine learning systems. So, in fact, we've even supported the use of machine learning to help bust bias and more accurately measure gender representation, for example, in media. A couple of years ago, we had launched a project with the Gina Davis Inclusion Quotient to really look at gender representation in media and film. So we host a wide array of machine learning interns, residents, professors, people from, colleagues from civil society, etc., each year, who try and bring outside perspectives into the work that we do. And we've also outsourced our own machine learning systems called TensorFlow, so that it's easier for everyone to participate in this process. So I think those are two things from a tech perspective that's important. But if you really were to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think it's really also very important, not for all organizations, not just the tech industry. So when we think about diversity, even in the workplace, because I think this, just speaks to what Purnima had mentioned earlier, it's really important as a company to also recognize that there are many dimensions of diversity that we need to address, whether this is gender parity and openness to forms of sexual orientation, disability, ethnic and social mix that really reflects the wider society. And there's no question that women and minority groups in tech are really underrepresented. So the pace of change, to have more diversity may be slow, but it's not just limited to the tech industry. And when it comes to female leadership, women in tech are almost at par with the rest of the economy. Especially if you were to look at the S&P 500 companies, right? But I really believe that every action and initiative that we undertake to address and improve diversity and inclusion in the workspace, for a private company, for example, is a step in the right direction, and it's progress towards making your products, your services, etc., also speak to what the needs of a very diverse world are. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Th- Thanks, Tenzin. Just following up on that with Jag, Tenzin talked of looking at this sort of diverse world and developing products, maybe in a way, right? What is a few recommendations that you have for the private sector in the way that product development is rolled out? In that, the internet space and the platforms that like the ones that you work with, what would you kind of say to that in terms of recommendations for the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think, overall and overarchingly, new technologies are very exciting. So, embracing new software solutions that are emerging, things like blockchain, which, we hope will unlock financial inclusion and empower economic participation for women, and sustainability. A bunch of things. I think, early stage technology companies are about culture. So I think having a very user-centric approach to technology and to design, that's embedded in our culture. I couldn't think of another way to operate without, building, not building a solution in search of a problem. Like, right. You start off with a problem that you're trying to solve, which is typically, incorporated in that is engaging the protagonists of that problem, right, and then incorporating them into the solution. And so I think in our company, at least, that's inherent. And I do see a trend, with the new generation of sort of new technology companies, that kind of user-centric approach is also inherent, which I think is good. And I think, look, technologies, there is a culture of scrutiny, there is adaptation inherent in technology, and there's a culture of improvement, right, in technology, right? So I think we need to have more women around the table. We need to have more women mediators. We need to have more women around sort of having honest conversations about what works and what doesn't, where problems are, where risks are, for example. And I think we need, obviously we've heard this with other speakers, we need more diversity, more women in tech. We need more women at the helm of companies, which is why kind of I'm excited to be doing what I'm doing. And we need collaboration, sort of, we need collaboration and integration. We don't need multiple point solutions for the same problem. We need, integration and communication, collaboration. And it's important to involve grassroots organizations. Something that we do repeatedly, and that I continue to want to do more, is to involve kind of grassroots organizations, NGOs, feet on the ground within our solution. And I think it's kind of intrinsic to our approach, and also to many other companies, to really kind of get the idea of the lived experience of women on the ground. So I think a few key words: culture, collaboration, embracing technologies, but also recognizing that the technology and the kind of startup space is part inherent, is this idea of continuous improvement in technology and scrutiny and adaptation and evolution, which I think is very exciting.
Thanks, Jag. And you talked of culture and collaboration. In terms of looking at that, and this is a great, and I hope that we get to have some of these conversations, because this is bringing people from very different perspectives. Helen, in a way, we've heard so many different thoughts in terms of what the private sector should be doing. We've heard a little bit about responsibility of different actors. What is your vision of a feminist internet, and where do you think private sector can play a role? Private sector and broader businesses, in a way, can play a role in enacting that vision.
So I think what we want in a feminist internet, or actually what we want in the internet, let's just call it that, right? Is women, gender diverse, queer people, everybody, and all other kinds of marginalized groups having meaningful access. What that, and not just access, meaningful access, that it is affordable, they can use it in the way they want, not what is prescribed. So there's agency, it's unconditional, it's open and unrestricted. So to do this, I mean, the first, who's at the table is the first thing. And, I think all the speakers have talked about it. But I won't just say we need women, gender diverse, and queer people at the table. I think we need feminists at the table who represent the interests of women, gender diverse, and queer people, right? And that they have voice in the places where tech is financed, where it's designed, where it's operated, and where decisions about tech governance is made. And now this essentially includes private sector companies, because starting with the base network layers all the way up to applications are predominantly financed, operated, and provided by profit-making private sector companies. So it goes beyond having a few women on the board. It means having feminist points of view in your workforce, on your boards, in accountability mechanisms, in the feedback loops that you set up. So that's really fundamental, I think, right? It's not, that's a really good step, but I think businesses, of course, need to work with private sector, but they also just need to work sort of coalitions amongst themselves, right? I mean, if you think about something like child pornography, there has been a systematic coming together, not just of civil society and the legal community, but tech companies to actually fight this. They haven't found perfect solutions, but things are certainly better than they were 20 years ago, right? Why? Um, uh, they've also come together to ward off the threat of lawsuits about copyrights when it comes to images and music. So why on earth is that not being extended to, for example, non-consensual sexual imagery of women that is rampant online, right? Why is tech not coming together and using technology for this? Because we know they can do it because they have done it before. The third thing, I think, is a real commitment on the part of tech companies, not just to identify bias, because a lot of times we don't know this going in with the systems, is a long-term commitment to set up the mechanisms to identify short and long-term bias that creeps in through their own monitoring and through setting up mechanisms that they get the signals from the outside before the collective action lawsuit happens, when a large group of people have been systematically discriminated against. Again, these are proactive things that you can do. And obviously transparency, consensual decision making, and so on, lots of the things that have been talked here.
Yeah, and I know both, some of you on this have worked on principles for feminist internet, and I don't think we have time to actually get into that. But if some of you are interested, please go search for it and look at the feminist principles of internet. Fascinating work that Jack and Helene and others have actually worked on. We'll take a few questions. If there are questions from the audience, it would be lovely to hear your thoughts. I'm not exactly sure where we'll see them, except there is a Google Doc. Is that the only one, or are there other places that we can see the question? That's the only one. One of the questions that I'm seeing right now, and Jag, if you can kind of talk about this, is about the role of about how migration and migrant women can actually be incorporated into the work. Especially, you talked about workers And we know even for garment workers, there's large section of people who are migrant workers. So, are there tools, and potentially can you actually look at the issue of migration within the technology that's available?
Yeah, migrant workers, form a large percentage of the workforce in the garment industry. And obviously, COVID has highlighted the many challenges around kind of that part of the labor force. I think a key thing, and I say the same with kind of, gender as well, right? Which is that we first of all need to know the facts at the factory and at the supplier level. We need to know the information. We need to know the composition of the workforce. We need to have data verified. We need to be able to trust that data, and only then can we begin to make, the necessary, interventions. And increasingly, of course, brands and retailers are under pressure to participate in this. But certainly, we're seeing a huge, one of the projects that we're working on right now, for example, is around being able to understand the risk of unauthorized subcontracting in the supply chain. And it's fascinating because that the root cause of that is around transparency, visibility, around kind of capacities, and then the overbooking that occurs, and then the labor that is brought on temporarily to solve those problems, and then the subcontract that occurs to riskier suppliers that don't have very good social compliance policies, and don't pay their migrant workers a living wage, force the migrant workers to work overtime. And so this is migrant workers are just kind of one component of the challenges, and of some of the solutions that we're developing that can kind of drive intervention. But first of all, we need to get sort of on the ground data that is accurate and reliable in order to kind of address that. And a lot of that data is by its very nature obfuscated, right? And sometimes that is with intent, and sometimes not. So I think it's one of the kind of the root causes.
Thanks, Jag. I we've heard from each other. I'm opening it up, and in case you have questions of the other panelists, would love to open it up to each of you. We don't get a chance to actually have such wonderful panelists at the same time. So if there are questions that you have of the other panelists, is there? Purnima's gone off again. I'm assuming then that there aren't any questions that you have of each other at this point. Great. I'm looking at questions from, there are no questions in a way, but there is a lot of conversations, or there are some comment around use of smartphones. We've not really talked of technology in that sense. We've only talked of, sort of the internet. Any thoughts on how this can, some of these kind of differences can be addressed, and are there some new ways that in different countries the smartphone divide is being addressed? If you have any thoughts or information around that, that would be lovely to hear. Helene, are you saying something?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just add sort of 2 points and let others obviously add, much more intelligent things, which is what we know in the global south is that very broadly, internet access tracks smartphone ownership. So roughly, if you're talking about 30% of phones being in the population smartphones, then roughly about 30% of that population of the population is likely to be online. So that's really one of the fundamental things that has to change if we want more people online and more women online. In Asia, we have a particular problem of older feature phones being in circulation and not being gotten rid of. Often the man, even when they get a smartphone, it's the father or the man of the house who will get the smartphone, and the older phone will be passed down to the children or the women. So the women are really the last to often get the smartphone. Even in countries like, and there's a huge gap in the percentage of men and women who own smartphones, very, slightly smaller than the kind of gender gaps in internet access I mentioned, but roughly tracking those numbers. Solving that is actually quite complicated because it means not only, a woman having enough money to get a phone, but it has to be with her to give her meaningful access. So what we saw again in some of the GSMA partnered studies that we did is that the woman is making the financial decision, saving the money and getting the phone. The family gets, because it's a really expensive purchase. In Myanmar, they're buying the $300 to $600 phones, right? But then the phone actually travels out of the house with the man or the daughter who's studying, and the woman who's in the house actually has very little access to that phone. So unless there's a second phone actually in the house, there isn't meaningful access. So I'll just stop there. There's lots of data actually on our website about quantified gender gaps in smartphone access.
Thanks, Alani. Anybody else that wants to kind of add to that? Great. We've had
Well,
a love. Go ahead, Jack.
yeah, so just to add to sort of Helani's point, talking about control over devices as being an important piece of this conversation, and actually so we know that mobile phones, they are extremely valuable. They are sort of like, one of the most critical points, lowest barrier to access to the internet that you could.
I wanted.
Oh, sorry. I think there might be a lag, so Punirma might be coming in. But just wanted to say very quickly around the like one point around smartphones, and then another point about thinking about access. So one is smartphones are critical. All of the points that Helani was mentioning is also key, and that the fact that there are also quite serious and significant security challenges when it comes to smartphones. So how do you access technology securely and safely if your primary and only point of connection is through a phone, whether it's a feature phone or a smartphone? Security is always going to be a key point. And when you add gender into it, we know that there is also a correlation between gender-based violence and ownership of technology. So there is that point. And then the other is also to think about kind of really paying attention to other kinds of diversity in thinking about access. So for example, community network projects. There's many of these in Asia and also many of these in different developing countries. And I think one of the more promising things around community access projects where more feminist and more women's rights activists has been involved in these projects is really to think through the gendered component from the point of thinking about solutions to training and capacity building around deciding what sort of technology access point infrastructure to deploy, and then management and resourcing and economic models and so on and so forth towards it. So I think there are more approaches than one when we want to think through this really significant issue of access and control over tech. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. I think we've had a fascinating discussion today, and I hope that we can take some of this. Our goal is to kind of make sure that some of this gets fed back into the UNDP larger conversations in terms of how they are looking at responsible business and human rights. So, thank you again to all the panelists for your time today and such a lovely, enriching discussion. Thanks again.